Sharing my screen now. So hopefully you can see a web page. So yes, thank you very much. And before I start showing you this tour of Carreg Cennen Castle, I thought it'd be useful just to very briefly go over some background to my PhD research, which frames why I've chosen Carreg Cennen today. So I'm an archaeology PhD student in my first year, and I'm looking at the differences in the landscapes of Welsh and English-built castles in Wales. And I'm specifically aiming to draw out the possible significances of those differences for our understanding of political power in Wales and its relationship with the built and the natural environments. So recently I've been working on developing a theoretical framework for thinking about this. So I'm drawing on Scott's legibility and also Foucault's heterotopia, but these ideas will all develop over the next couple of years. And today I'm focusing on Carreg Cennen because it's also one of the castles that I'll be looking at as part of my broader PhD research aims. But here I'm using the castle to demonstrate the potential of story maps as an outreach tool in heritage and also in our experience of the historic and archaeological landscapes more broadly. So this story map presents a tour of Carreg Cennen Castle, which is split into 3 sections. So the castle's history, followed by its landscape, and then its architecture. And I'm going to begin scrolling through the tour now, but for this presentation, it's not my intention for the tour to be used specifically as a tour. Rather, it'll be a backdrop for me to focus on and showcase the potential of story maps as a digital platform. And I'll pause in relevant places that best demonstrate that potential. So after the presentation, the story map will be available for anyone to use. And at that point, its intended function is to provide an overview of the history of Carreg Cennen Castle and its landscape for anyone who's interested in just finding out a bit more about the castle and engaging with the site in a different way. So obviously I've already mentioned the word lots, story maps. What is a story map? A story map is a service run by Esri who make ArcGIS, and they're a permanent webpage, which is obviously a great attribute for any public engagement project because they can be accessed at any time. They can be interactive, so the viewer can control the pace of their own tour. And they're a great way of displaying lots of different types of media content alongside spatial information like maps. So they're also free to use if your university has a subscription. And finally, they're also very easy to make, which is great, obviously. So for me, the most time-consuming and difficult part of this story map on Carreg Cennen was the imagery itself. So I was lucky in that I obtained a grant to use a drone, but I'm not a drone user. I've never spent lots of time using them before, so this was a learning curve. And I would just definitely recommend that if you're planning on producing a story map on a site or a landscape, definitely factor in the time to sort out details such as arranging your images. So I'm not going to go into lots of detail during the presentation on how to make a story map. But if this is something you're interested in doing and you've never made a story map before, then I have produced a handout guide with a colleague of mine from Oxford, and we can just email that across to you. So my contact details are at the bottom of the story map. So yeah, please just feel free to get in touch. It's also worth noting that story maps are being used by a whole range of individuals and organisations. So, for example, the National Geographic have put together a number of story maps on what they call their explorer stories. So they are widely used. So firstly, and this might sound very obvious, it's really important to figure out what your aims are for your story map before you start building it. So getting a structure just keeps your story narrow and into something that's more manageable. So for example, earlier this year, I produced a story map on Abergavenny Castle, which is also in South Wales. Sorry, I should have said Carreg Cennen is in South Wales. And essentially the purpose of this story map was it was produced in the context of a British Archaeological Association programme that was seeking to promote heritage sites that were closed due to the COVID restrictions. So the aim of the story map was just supposed to provide a very general and broad overview of the castle without any particular angle, just for anyone who had hoped to visit and couldn't. So with Carreg Cennen, I have two key aims of this story map. So the first one was to link into my broader PhD research, which seeks to reprioritise and reintegrate the landscape within our understanding of the castle and political power. And I just felt very aware that whenever I visited pretty much any castle, we're told very little, if anything at all, about the surrounding landscape. And the interpretation boards focus heavily on the castle's architecture. And this story map doesn't fully remedy this situation, but it does dedicate a section to the landscape before even moving on to consider the castle's architecture. And I just think that whilst this section could be developed in many ways, rather than viewing that as any kind of limitation, I'm seeing it as demonstrating the richness of an approach that considers the landscape as well as the castle's architecture. So my second key aim of this story map was to produce a resource that could increase the accessibility of Carreg Cennen Castle. So as you've probably gathered, the castle is located in a fairly dramatic location, about 90 metres above the River Cennen in the valley below. So it makes access for a lot of people tricky and perhaps not possible at all. So I feel that a resource such as story maps is a step toward trying to include people in heritage, which is obviously supposed to be shared, but in reality sometimes isn't. And in addition to this, it also increases the accessibility of the castle for anyone who's interested in castle building in Wales, but lives far away from Wales and is therefore unlikely to ever visit Wales or the castle anytime soon. So it's an inherently visual resource that can complement the other research that they might be doing and help to contextualize their own research. So this section, which I've just scrolled down to on the landscape, I've included this brief quote here because part of it, a most comprehensive view, forms part of the title for my conference paper. And it's a quote from 1861 from a newspaper article, basically describing someone's experience of visiting Carreg Cennen Castle. And the view the author is describing here is from a nearby small hill overlooking the castle. And I chose to include it because it kind of sums up both literally and I guess also theoretically what I'd like to encourage people to consider when they visit Carreg Cennen Castle or any other castle, which is to experience and comprehend the landscape before focusing on the castle's architecture. So encouraging a staged approach to the castle. So following on from this, I include a little bit of data analysis. So this is of topographic prominence, which I've done for Carreg Cennen Castle. And it's produced using an application called Landsurf, which extracts and then classifies features into types. And then these types are then symbolized by color. So the focus here is on the gray, the lightest color, and the blue, which symbolize low-lying landscapes. And then the yellow, which symbolizes a ridge. And the outline of the castle is in orange. So this obviously shows that Carreg Cennen is constructed on a ridge, which is symbolized by the yellow. And whilst the representation shows that there are other ridges around the castle, especially to the north, the remaining landscape is dominated by this grey and blue. And I think this is useful to support my aim to reintegrate the landscape into our understanding of the castle, because it highlights that a very obvious choice was made here in the siting of the castle, in that a ridge position was privileged over all locally available flatter landscapes that dominate the surroundings, especially to the south. And this encourages us to think about the significance of the choice made by the castle builder and what, if any, impact did that have for political power in the region? And also, how does this compare to other castles built by the English and the Welsh in Wales? And if so, why is this important? So the story map doesn't go into answering any of these questions, because ultimately that's what I'm going to try and do throughout the duration of my PhD. But it does emphasize that the landscape is important and is worth thinking about in more detail, and sparks questions that perhaps wouldn't have been considered without this kind of analysis. So it's also useful as an outreach tool because it can be tricky without visiting a site to gauge the makeup of the landscape. And often people are just left with a couple of images of the landscape. So this complements all the other imagery we've seen and facilitates an experience of the landscape, which is both more informed and also more engaged. So I then break my data up with another video, which I think just adds variation and also helps to make the data feel less abstract in that it becomes more recognizable and localizable within the landscape. So after this video, I move on to the final piece of data analysis, which is of visibility. And essentially what these colors mean is the green color correlates to the field of view afforded by the castle's topography over the surrounding landscape, and the pink colour to the field of view afforded by the castle's architecture over the surrounding landscape. And anything that's white simply means that the landscape is in view of the castle. So you can see the topography here of Carreg Cennen is responsible for the castle's relatively wide field of view, much more so than the castle's architecture. And again, this demonstrates the importance of reintegrating the landscape within castle studies and investigating the landscape's impact on the function of the castle, which in turn has implications for our understanding of power. And specifically, this visibility analysis encourages us to think about what that might mean in terms of Carreg Cennen Castle's ability to monitor and exert control over the surrounding landscape and the people who would have lived within that landscape. So again, it's a useful tool to integrate into this kind of tour, as it also enhances the accessibility of the castle. So even if you are able to visit the castle, this sort of analysis defines with certainty what can and can't be seen, which isn't always possible for us to do even when we're there, perhaps because of where we're stood or eyesight, etc. So attention to the landscape, both through the topographic and visibility analyses, encourages us to think about how the landscape impacts on the form and the function of the castle, not just on how the castle impacts on the landscape. And this is something that I will be exploring further over the next couple of years. So I then move on to the final section of my tour of Carreg Cennen Castle, which looks at the castle itself and its architecture. So this is made using something called a map tour, which is a tool within StoryMaps. And it allows you to label an image or a map, as you can see on the right-hand side, with however many numbers you want. So I've got 11, and then each number corresponds to a feature that you'd like to highlight, which you can then talk more about on the left-hand side. So you can include text, as I've done, and images, but you can also include video as well. So each of the 11 points I've included allows you to follow the approximate route that you might take if you were visiting the castle in person, starting obviously at point 1, which is the outer gate, and then working your way in. And it serves as a guide, sort of how you would tour the castle if you were there in person. It also allows a really fantastic level of orientation, which you wouldn't necessarily get if you were at the castle itself, because obviously you're not afforded this aerial shot of the castle. So that can be helpful just to place yourself within the site and the landscape more broadly. So I appreciate I'm going through this quite quickly, but there would just be too much to read otherwise. So then after this map tour, I use another tool within StoryMaps, which is called a slider, and it allows you to overlay different images. So for example, here on the left, I've got an artist's impression of the castle circa 1300. And then the image that you can now see being revealed is just a recent image that I took of the castle. So yeah, you can overlay the two things, and it allows people to quite quickly and easily see change over time. And that's especially useful for if you're using maps, because obviously you can see how a landscape or a city or a town has changed over time. And it's also obviously very interactive, which is great for any sort of outreach purpose. So I then finished the story map just with a selection of stills of the castle. And this is using a tool called the gallery in StoryMaps, which allows you to showcase lots of imagery, which I think helps the tour feel more engaging and also more experienced, and attempts to place people within the landscape itself. So that is the end of my story map. Thank you very much. I really hope that it does showcase the potential of using story maps in understanding sites and landscapes. And yeah, please do feel free to get in touch if you would like to use the guide. My email's here, and also Twitter, etc. And yeah, it'd be really great to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. I'm sure we have lots of questions coming up. I wasn't